Okay, guys, hi. In lieu of the tutorials that we missed, I thought I'll just do a podcast so that all the tutorial groups will be able to get on the same page at the same time. I promise to try to keep this short, and today we'll just be looking at one case study. So do try to listen to this case study before you come for lecture tomorrow and before you attempt the graded assignment as well, because I think Philippines can be a good case study to consider when you do comparative analysis. It can be a very useful case study to help you understand and account for the failure of democracy. So today we'll be looking at Philippines, this case study, and we'll go through the entire thing the same way as the other case studies as well. So the first thing about the Philippines, you can see that geographically speaking, it is very much on the edge of Southeast Asia. Well, one of the key identity crises that the Philippines face is why are they a part of Southeast Asia? And should they be a part of Southeast Asia? Even though on the map it looks like it's quite close and all that, but you can see that it is quite far out into the sea. It is an archipelago by itself. We'll talk more about it later. But one of the big things about it has been its integration with Southeast Asia. It's quite geographically distant, and somehow or another that would affect its political integration with Southeast Asia as a whole, as a region as well. And I think just want to use this case study to underscore that Southeast Asia really is a construction, uh, very much built on what happened during the colonial period. So as we went through the individual case studies, you could see that many of the individual nations were constructed by the colonial period. But so too the region as a whole is constructed by the colonial period as well. A lot of the political development, a lot of the political foundations come from the colonial period. Now, the region as a whole, this term called Southeast Asia, it didn't really have any currency until after the war. It was just a convenient term to categorize the entire region, and Philippines is put inside this region called Southeast Asia. So in terms of whether this is natural, it isn't. But the governments of all the Southeast Asian nations still need to try to make some sense of it, and to try to integrate together as a region and as a nation itself. So speaking of a nation, you can see much like Indonesia with comparative analysis, much like Indonesia, Philippines, it's an archipelago nation as well. It's split up into three big portions: Luzon at the north, the Visayas in the central regions, and Mindanao in the south. So the same problems that you saw with Indonesia, the structural integration of the nation, the unity of the nation, those kind of problems, you would see it in Philippines as well. Um, where is the capital? It is Manila, and it is in the northern region with Luzon, and that is very distinct from the periphery in the Visayas and Mindanao. So there's a lot of integration problems, and any government that comes into office would have to deal with the integration of this nation. Again, this is not a natural formation. Like Philippines wasn't as it is like this. It was because of American colonialism and the Spanish colonialism before that. But this is the nation as it is now, and any government that comes to the fore has to deal with the complexities of all the different diversities within the three separate territories over here. You can see that on this matter of diversity, Philippines is no less diverse than some of the other case studies that we've been through. We can see that again, the dominant group, the people that we know of, or we think of as Filipinos, those that are working here in Singapore, more or less they come from the northern region of Luzon. Some of them come from the Visayas. Very, very few of them come from the region of Mindanao. But there's just like some of the other case studies that you saw, there are center periphery kind of divides. And this concerns an issue about power. Where does power lie? And for Philippines, power seems to lie with Manila. It seems to lie with the region of Luzon. In terms of economics, you can see here also that most of the development is in the northern regions in Luzon as well. And as you go further and further away from Luzon, there are issues of underdevelopment, there are issues of inequalities, there are issues of disparities. and that would also figure into the governance of the state, much like some of the other case studies that we saw. Philippines also has security issues, like domestic security issues. There is a separatist movement that rings on all the way till today. It is in the south, in the Mindanao region, much like Thailand actually. So Thailand, you had a separatist movement in the south with the Patani region, and in the Philippines, you have a southern separatist movement with the Mindanao region as well. Doing a comparative analysis, actually both of them have the same kind of, the nature of their separatism is quite similar in that both concern religion. So Mindanao is mostly composed of Muslims and Islamic practicing peoples, compared to the dominant Catholicism that the rest of the Philippines practices. Then there are also issues of economic disparities and underdevelopment for the south as compared to the north. So there are those kind of issues as well which compound on the religious differences. So with all this resentment, it breeds extreme reaction and response, and there you have our separatist movements in the south of the Philippines. So again, like any government that comes into the fore, they would need to have some strategy to deal with these separatist movements. Now, one of the big differences of the Philippines compared to the other case studies, again, comparative analysis here, is to do with the foundations of democracy. Now, the Philippines, unlike the other case studies, had a greater exposure to democracy under American colonial rule. So, under American colonial rule, there was a genuine exposure to democratic institutions, democratic principles, democratic ideals, democratic processes, and so on. But the idea here is that, unlike the other case studies, Philippines did get a good measure of a democratic experience from the Americans. So, like the other case studies, we talked about how their democratic foundations are weak, and correspondingly, their authoritarian culture is very strong. Well, for the Philippines, it kind of, you can see it as the other way around, where the democratic foundations are fairly strong, and the authoritarian culture is not that magnified in the Philippines. Their traditional authoritarianism isn't that pervasive as compared to the other case studies. So what you have is that you have a healthy exposure to democracy even during the colonial period under the American rule. Give you an example, I mean the examples you can see all here, but you can see that there are local political parties, in this case the Nationalista Party. They are competing in their own local elections, they are a functioning party, and they do get some good degree of democratic exposure. So all this sets a very good foundation for democracy in the Philippines. When the war comes, there is a disruption to this healthy functioning of democracy because of the nature of war. But does that entirely collapse the foundations of democracy in the Philippines? I don't think so. And what we have actually as evidence is that when the war ends, many of these democratic institutions and parties and leaders, they actually remain intact in that they are still there, they are still present, they are picking up where they left off. So the Nationalista Party, which is the dominant party, is still there. They have a good commitment to democracy. They practice processes that align to democratic principles and things like that. But there are two further, you can call it events that further solidify the pervasiveness of democracy in the post-war period. The second one you can see here is the American commitment to the Atlantic Charter. Now, keep in mind that this is, you're entering the Cold War period, the early stages of the Cold War period now, and the Atlantic Charter is a document that stresses self-determination. And the Atlantic Charter is a charter that also stresses a lot of democratic ideals and the freedoms of the peoples and of the nations and things like that. Now, the Americans at this stage, 1945, they are still the colonial masters of the Philippines, so they would want to practice what they preach as well. So many of their democratic tutelage, many of their democratic guidance of the Philippines is further reinforced by the ideals of the Atlantic Charter. They want to keep Philippines democratic, if not for itself, then at least to serve some sort of Cold War anti-communist purpose as well. The third point, it further reinforces this idea of the dominating effect of the Cold War in that the Philippines, it figures very strategically into the American strategy and foreign policy for the Cold War. By now you already know that in Vietnam there's a huge communist presence and all that kind of stuff. Domino theory is coming into effect in the minds of the Americans. So they need bases in Southeast Asia in order to launch any counter-offensive against the communists. Now, Philippines alongside Thailand is one such case. But comparative analysis, the difference between Philippines and Thailand is that in Thailand, the democratic foundations weren't very strong. And so the Americans increasingly looked to military leaders to stem the tide of communism. Now, the difference in the Philippines is that the democratic foundations are strong. And therefore, what the Americans did initially is to continue to reaffirm democracy in the Philippines as a means to stem the tide of communism. They wanted to, establish the credibility and the capability of democracy in the Philippines. So, as we enter Philippines, their independent period, they received independence pretty fast, less than a year. By 1946, actually on 4th of July, the same Independence Day as the Americans, 4th of July 1946, Philippines also receives its independence pretty fast. Does that mean, when Philippines receives independence, does that mean that the American connection is lost? No, definitely not, because of the Cold War principles and all that kind of stuff. So there would be a continuing guidance and tutelage of democracy by the Americans to the Philippines. The Philippines themselves also have a high level of commitment to democracy, so they themselves will be adhering to its principles and processes. Now, one of the things that we want to highlight that is unique to Philippine democracy is that it is, number one, it is a presidential democracy. And with presidential democracies, I did mention to you guys that there's a heavy focus on the leader, that one single individual, the chief executive. This also aligns with Philippine politics, like traditional Philippine politics, where the personality of the leader has always played a larger role than the party itself. So this kind of presidential democracy and their traditional culture, it perfectly aligns, and it kind of reinforces the idea of the leader. So it's quite elite-led in that sense, their brand of democracy. And when you consolidate everything in their political culture, you can see that a lot of it comes down to personality politics. So it is not directly linked to authoritarianism, but you can see that such structures can be very vulnerable to authoritarianism because of the familiarity to personality politics, the familiarity to the idea that power flows from one leader down to society. This can potentially open up vulnerabilities towards authoritarianism seeping in. So while the foundations of Philippine democracy are strong, their version and their brand of democracy also generates some sort of vulnerability that might seep them into authoritarianism somewhere down the road, as they eventually did go to later on. So with personality politics, there is also going to be a clash of personalities. We've seen in some of the other case studies that there are elite level infighting. So elite level infighting can be between personalities, like leader versus leader, or it can be within a coalition government where there's a party versus party. But whatever it is elite level because these clashes occur within the government itself. Now, in the Philippines, because of personality politics, there is going to be clashes. There are clashes among the top few. However, is it really that severe until it collapses the entire democratic integrity? I don't think so. I think this is just a normal facet of presidential politics where leaders need to contest against one another, but their infighting, is it severe? Does it compromise the entire system, the integrity of the framework? I don't think so. Furthermore, there are regularity of elections. This is where they contest. So it's still within a democratic framework, and because of the regularity of elections, the entire framework is still pretty much intact and quite robust, at least for the first 2 decades or so of Philippine politics after the war. Philippines does face the similar problems to the other case study. There are security problems, there are economic problems, but for at least the first 2 decades of Philippine independence, the Democratic Party, the democratic system, seems to be able to handle these problems in that it didn't spill over to such a severe state as for people to want to choose alternative systems of government. So you can see from this slide here that there are many security problems, and these problems are consistent and long-standing. The economic problems as well, there are issues with disparities and inequalities, and it's not very easily solved. But there is consistent effort from the democratic governments. The democratic system in itself, it stays intact. There is no major questioning of the democratic system. No one is calling for an abandonment of it. No one is calling for, a dismantling of it. The leaders themselves, they still want to abide by democratic principles, and they largely keep it intact as well. So going back to that point though, it also can further help you to reinforce a point about the political will of the leaders. You see that we face, across the case studies, they face similar problems. But why do one set of case studies collapse into authoritarianism and the other one continues to maintain democracy to approach these problems? It might come down to political will, the personalities of the leaders themselves, the commitment, the level of commitment they have to democracy and to its smooth functioning processes. So that's something for you all to think about as well. Now this guy, Marcos, Ferdinand Marcos, with him coming to the presidential office, everything kind of changes in Philippine politics. So once again, he is, based on personality politics, he is a really prominent guy in Philippine politics. He was popular among the people. He was legally, electorally voted into office. So he has got all the credentials, and for a while he continued to abide by democratic processes, principles, and continued to serve as a democratic president. He also had the support of the US. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that he is like a US puppet, like Noordin Diem, for instance. But he did heavily depend on US support, and US in turn also heavily depended on him. So there's some sort of connection there. But the point is that there is some measure of credibility attached to Marcos, even from the external point of view. And to further show that, the last point over here is about ASEAN, in that he is one of the founding members of ASEAN. So from an external point of view and from an internal point of view, there is a lot of credibility attached to Marcos in this early stage. And he was doing well in politics. The problem with Marcos comes in when he views democracy as a tool in which he can use to solidify and to consolidate his hold on power. And very early on, sometime in his first, going into his second term, you can see that his authoritarian tendencies, it all starts to surface again. Now, at the same time, with his authoritarian tendencies coming more and more prominent to the fore, the Philippine domestic landscape is not doing well. So the security threats are getting larger and larger, and the economic problems are also getting larger and larger. So in tandem with the rise of his own authoritarian tendencies, there is a worsening situation in the country. when there were elections called, and you can see the authoritarian tendencies starting to come to the fore a bit more. There was a lot of accusation against Marcos for his corruptive practices, for his vote buying, calling the election results as illegitimate because of the actions that he had done, pretty shady kind of stuff. So all these things together, you take everything together about his own position, about the country's position, it equates into a very sharp insecurity and vulnerability attached to his own sense of his position right now. So he wins the election, but there is a sharp sense of insecurity that starts to seep in. And with the authoritarian tendencies that he has, this is where it comes to a critical point, and he starts to make his move in dismantling democracy. So again, this period of time is called the first quarter storm. Things start to get really bad. There's a lot of social unrest, and even there's a sharp security threat in the communists as well. So what does Marcos do? He plays up the communist threat, uses it as some kind of pretext, and with the US support, he declares martial law in 1972. Now, we have seen this before in Indonesia with Sukarno. He declares martial law, suspends democracy, suspends normal democratic proceedings, and enters into a period of basically virtual dictatorship. And democracy is not to see the light of day until I think about 13, maybe 15 years later for the Philippines. He does this on the justification that we need national stability. And while there may be some credence to that argument given all the social unrest going on, but you can tell that this was a power move and a power play by the president himself. So these are all the things that you can see: the physical dismantling of democracy itself, the processes start to disappear, the institutions are diluted, and there's a lot of centralization of power onto the chief executive, which is himself. So the virtual dictatorship for the next 13 years, arbitrary use of power. There's not much elections. In fact, I don't think there were any elections at all, and even if there were, probably cosmetic in nature. At this point in time, drunk with power, he engages in a lot of corruptive practices as well, starts to embezzle a lot of money and all that kind of stuff. He plunders the economy. His statesmen, that means his cabinet, they are also no angels. They are crooks as well, and it pretty soon becomes a picture where the leading statesmen of the Philippines themselves are acting against their own state. They are betraying their own state in such a degree. So there's some issues there with the quality of the leadership or the integrity of the leadership with the Philippines. So with the problems with what's happening at the elite level in Philippine politics, you can see there's a spillover effect in the societal level and the mass level as well. The economy, which wasn't doing well to start off with, starts to deteriorate even further, and this hits the people at their most intimate of levels. And so this generates a whole critical mass of violence and unrest, as you can see over here. They call it the people power movement of the 1980s, and you can see that there is such a variety and there's such a spectrum of the entire society that mobilizes against Marcos and his leadership. You can see that you can use this example to show that when Philippines enters into a period of authoritarianism, there is quite popular backlash against it, which might stress their democratic foundations and their democratic inclinations. This is another way for you to prove that democracy was fairly strong in the Philippines. The foundations were fairly strong. Long story short, there is a counter reaction against Marcos and the Aquino family. First, it was this guy called Benigno Aquino, and then later Corazon Aquino. They rallied against Marcos, and long story short, with the power of the people and all that, they managed to force Marcos from power. And thereafter, Philippines enters back into a stable period of democracy again. again, this would be another way for you to prove that the democratic foundations for the Philippines were strong, because once this unique personality was removed from politics, normal democracy resumed. After this, the presidents, they served for one, maximum 2 terms, and there was no more movement into authoritarianism. Presidential democracy was re-established in a very sustainable fashion. So I think that's one other way you can show that the democracy was strong in the Philippines. So at the end, to consolidate this entire thing, we got to ask ourselves about Philippine democracy, the integrity of it. Was it genuine? Was it sustainable? Was it consistent? Did it even fail in the first place? Was Marcos an anomaly? Or do you think that Marcos represented a core characteristic of the brand of democracy Philippines faced? And that also leans towards authoritarianism. Yeah, so think about the Philippines itself and try to integrate it, comparative analysis, with the other case studies as well, to see how it can fit together with your other case studies and how it can help your argument. Okay, thanks guys.